just feel now I have the choice. You know, if I want to go back to America, stay here, I'm open to do so. But I'm good. Okay, guys. So we're talking about the Queen, Marilyn Monroe. Now, Joe, thank you so much for suggesting this subject of Marilyn Monroe. I'm going to talk about her childhood and her upbringing because, well, we have access to information now, so we can know what Marilyn really dealt with. But I can imagine living back in her time. You could look at Marilyn and think, wow, she's perfect, has a perfect life. And behind all of the glitz and glamour, Marilyn had a very, very complicated and difficult, hurtful childhood. And through it all, she was able to create a beautiful life for herself at a young age. Let's get into the story of Marilyn Monroe. So Marilyn was born June 1st, 1926, and I'm also going to refer to her actual name, which is Norma Jean. So if you hear me say Norma Jean, it's Marilyn Monroe I'm talking about. I may mix up the two. So I'll start with Norma Jean since we're going back to the beginning of her life. She was born the 1st of June in 1926. And she was born to her 24-year-old mother, whose name was Gladys Baker. The way that that's said to her, she was born to her mother, of course. So her mom was 24 years old when she had her. Now, she brought her 2-week-old baby, Norma Jean Denson, to a foster home of Ida and Wayne Bolander in Hawthorne, California. So, Norma Jean's mother, Gladys Baker, suffered from depression. And Gladys we're going to talk about her for a little bit. She was born on May 27th in the year of 1902. Gladys was pregnant and married to a much older man named Jasper Baker, and she got married to him just before her 15th birthday. So the relationship that she had with this guy was abusive. He would call her vile names and, caused her extreme mental pain, anxiety, and humiliation. Eventually, Gladys filed for divorce always maintained that she believed it was Charles Stanley Gifford. Now, when she gave birth to Norma Jean, that guy was long gone, and Gladys was on her own trying to care for this new baby, while also holding down a full-time job and dealing with depression and still sadness from the loss of her 2 kids. She had a lot on her plate that she just couldn't handle, and little help. Now, Marilyn, or Norma Jean, was only 2 weeks old when Gladys first dropped her off at the foster home in Hawthorne. You know, like I mentioned, Gladys already lost her 2 kids, so she was really eager to find a way to not lose Norma Jean while also getting help to take care of her. So, even though Norma Jean stayed at this foster home, Gladys would come and take her periodically for sleepovers. And when Norma Jean was 3 years old, Gladys would make attempts to break in to the foster home, placing her little daughter in a duffel bag, guys, and locking out the foster mother, so basically trying to kidnap her own child. And when Norma Jean was 7 years old, Gladys got back custody and was in Gladys's care, living in her house in 1933. And at this time, Gladys did buy a house, which was great news. So Norma Jean lived with several lodgers. Gladys brought a piano, and in the home, it was always filled with music, you know, singing and dancing. However, this new happiness didn't last very long. Not long after moving into that house, Gladys's grandfather actually took his own life, sadly. And then, her 15-year-old son, Robert, who got taken away by his dad to Kentucky, passed away from tuberculosis of the kidneys, and it just shattered Gladys's world. I mean, she had just come up out of water for some air and just got shot right back down. And now, during 1934, Gladys's mental health deteriorated so much, and Norma Jean spent a lot of time on her own, playing with empty whiskey bottles, and Marilyn Monroe, who we know, she said, "Of this time, I must have had the finest collection of bottles any girl ever had. I'd line them up on a plank beside the road, and when people drove along, I'd say, 'Wouldn't you like some whiskey?'" Her mother was institutionalized for paranoid schizophrenia, which, you know, shortly after. So Norma Jean spent her childhood in 2 different orphanages and 10 different foster homes, which is so much for a child. And she faced abuse, she would also say that I'm gonna be an actress one day, which made people just laugh even more. Watching movies with her mother or with Grace or by herself was one of her favorite activities, and she looked up to Greta Garbo and Joan Crawford and Jean Harlow. So Norma Jean moved in with a family friend at age 11, which is Grace McKee, and she said if not for Grace, I would have been sent to a state or county institution where there are fewer privileges, such as not being allowed to have a Christmas tree or seeing a movie sometimes. Oh my goodness. I lived in an orphanage, only off and on, and most of the time I was placed with the family, who were given $5 a week for keeping me. I was placed in 9 different families before I was able to quit being a legal orphan. I did this at 16 by getting married. Okay, so when Grace McKee and her husband announced to Norma Jean that they would be moving to West Virginia, they offered her, and she was 15 at the time, they offered her the choice between marrying a man named James Dougherty, who was the 21-year-old son of a former neighbor, or returning to the orphanage. And so of course she chose the marriage to get out of that orphanage situation. And she would go to the movies, and she said that I didn't like the world around me because it was kind of grim. When I heard that this was acting, I said, this is what I want to be. In 1944, having had her picture taken working at a munitions factory, Norma Jean quit to become a model for a photographer against the wishes of her first husband. Basically, they got married in 1942 and divorced by 1946. So when it came time for Norma Jean to choose a stage name, we all know what name she chose: Marilyn Monroe. Now, she chose that because Marilyn is her mother's maiden name. But that was the only part of her own life, of her old life, that she would actually disclose at first. She said, I used to tell lies in my interviews, chiefly about my mother and father. She said, I'd say that my mother was dead and that my father was somewhere in Europe. I lied because I was ashamed to have the world know that my mother was in a mental institution and that I had been born out of wedlock and never heard my father's voice. In one letter, written in 1945, Gladys seemed lucid and happy, thanking Norma Jean for a card and mentioning her marriage to James. And so that's kind of going back a little bit. And by the time that she was released from the institution, her letters to Marilyn it made it seem that she was well, that she was cured, but it wasn't the case. So now Marilyn Monroe was in her career. She was a successful model, and something strange happened because while Marilyn Monroe was on a trip with Gladys and tried to make it a successful reunion, Gladys barely said a word to her. It was very awkward and died through DNA testing, and it was confirmed that her father was Charles Stanley Gifford, who, we talked about earlier, and that was confirmed in 2022, so very recently. And so, anyways, Marilyn would gaze upon a photo of Clark Gable because she said he looked like my father, especially the way that he wore the way that he wore his hat and how his mustache was. And she said, years later, I found out what his name was and many other things about it, and how he used to live in the same apartment building where my mother lived, and how they fell in love, and also how he laughed at her while she was being born without ever seeing her. And she said the strange thing was that everything I heard about him actually made her feel warmer towards him. And she said the night that I had his picture, I dreamed of it when I fell asleep. I dreamed of it 1,000 times after. Now, her father dismissed his daughter's attempt at contact, and he was so mean and cold. He said, look, I'm married and have a family. And he said, I don't have anything to say to you, call my lawyer. And Marilyn was obviously devastated. I mean, you put your heart out there on the line like that to connect with the man responsible for giving you life, and it's just rejection. After already feeling rejected as a child of not having him. And so this affected her relationships, She put all of her hopes into the men that she dated, and she was looking for this kind of father, looking for a savior. She's described as someone who was born into turmoil and spent the rest of her life looking to be saved. And this drama, not just with her father, but just her life, it really affected her outlook on motherhood. And she said, having a child, that's always been my biggest fear. I want a child and I fear a child. Whenever I came close, my body said no, and I lost the baby. She talked about being afraid that she wind up like her mother, who was in and out of institutions all her life. Marilyn was a 25-year-old rising star when she met Joe DiMaggio in 1952. Now Joe was 12 years older than her, and he had just retired from the New York Yankees. Joe was reading a newspaper when he saw a picture of Marilyn Monroe in a baseball uniform. He was incredibly interested. He made a phone call and requested to have a date with Marilyn Monroe. So they went to dinner on Sunset Boulevard, and apparently Joe didn't even really speak. It was awkward, and Marilyn said that she expected a flashy New York sports type guy, and instead she met this reserved guy who didn't make a pass at her right away. And from the outside, the relationship between Marilyn and Joe seemed like it was a match made in heaven in Hollywood, But after 274 days of being married, they called it quits, and their time together was described as tumultuous. On the 15th of September 1954, Marilyn filmed a scene which is iconic called the 7-Year Itch, where her white dress was admitted into a psych ward. What was meant to be prescribed as a rest cure turned into a 3-day nightmare in which Marilyn was kept in a locked and padded room against her will. In March of 1961, she wrote a letter to Dr. Ralph Greenson, her psychiatrist, detailing this experience, and she said, "The inhumanity there I found archaic. Everything was under lock and key. The doors have windows so patients can be visible all the time. Also, the violence and markings still remain on the walls from former patients." It was Joe DiMaggio who she called to help get her out. In June of that year, he was by her side when she woke up from emergency gallbladder removal surgery. And on August 5th, 1962, so on August 5th, 1926, Marilyn was found dead in her bed, in her home in Los Angeles. And, she was discovered with a telephone in one hand and prescription pills around her prescribed to treat depression. It was littered around the room, and after a brief investigation, the LAPD concluded that her death was caused by a self-administered overdose of sedative drugs. And it was actually Joe DiMaggio that planned her funeral. He bent to her casket and repeated, "I love you, I love you." Oh my goodness. So sad. And Joe planned her funeral. And he said, and he told everybody that he and Marilyn belonged together. He actually barred the Hollywood elite from attending the funeral because he didn't want the focus of the funeral to be what he thought killed her, which was ultimately her fame. And Joe had fresh roses delivered to her tomb, her grave, twice a week for 20 years, and he actually lived about 40 years longer than her. I think also when her mom found out about her death, her mom wrote, may God bless her soul, but it didn't seem that she was visibly shaken or devastated. But at the same time, we have to keep in mind that her mom was dealing with mental illness, so whatever reaction we think a mom should have, it wasn't coming from her. I don't know, it really made me feel sad because I feel Marilyn, I don't know if she ever really had a moment where she just enjoyed her life. Obviously she had success, but she lacked in really finding a partner, a man that made her feel safe and loved and experiencing that kind of love, which obviously was connected to her own situation with her biological father or mother, dealing with abandonment issues. And not to say that that's the joy of life, a relationship, but it's one aspect. And I think she had happiness in her career, what she did. I mean, she got to do what she loved. She made her younger self so proud. person that she called when she was in some real trouble. So she knew